The title of this lecture is The Church and the French Revolution. The causes of the French Revolution are complex. We will concentrate very briefly on two main causes: the emergence of liberal political philosophy and the crisis created by the French national debt. First, there was the emergence of and popularization of liberal political philosophy. Now, I am not using the word liberal in the sense that it is used in contemporary American politics, that is, the Democratic Party. By liberal, I mean a political philosophy that rejects traditional notions of legitimacy and authority and promotes individual liberty, some form of representative democracy, and equality. Such ideas had their origin in Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. John Locke, an English statesman, was one of the first to put forward the idea that government derives its legitimacy not from tradition or some kind of divine right of kings, but from the consent of the people. Locke also maintained that individuals are born in a state of natural equality, possessing the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. These ideas were a direct challenge to the centuries-old hierarchical system of order that had defined Western civilization up to this point. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a French political theorist. Like many of the Enlightenment thinkers of his day, Rousseau was highly critical of traditional society. Rousseau maintained, like Locke, that individuals were born free. Human beings had become enslaved by social convention and traditional notions of authority. Rousseau writes, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Those who think themselves the masters of others are indeed greater slaves than they." Political legitimacy, Rousseau maintained, was found in what he called the general will. This refers to the will of the people as a whole expressed in law, and to which all are subject without regard to class, status, or station in life. It was this particular idea that found expression in the French Revolution, as we shall see. Another cause of the revolution was the French national debt. France had been involved in two costly wars in the past 30 years. The 7 Years' War with Britain, in which France suffered a humiliating defeat, and the American War for Independence, in which France provided assistance to the American colonies in their struggle for independence from Britain. These two wars contributed to a huge national debt, and the king needed to raise revenues by imposing new taxes. However, taxes were unfairly levied on the commoners, since clergy and nobility were exempt from paying taxes. This situation fostered a long-standing and deeply felt resentment on the part of the poorer classes of France. In order to raise funds to pay down the national debt, in 1789, King Louis XVI convened the États Généraux. What was the États Généraux? It was the closest thing France had to a national assembly at the time. It was not a legislative, but a consultative body composed of the three broadest classes or estates of the kingdom. The first estate consisted of the clergy, that is, the bishops and priests. The second estate was comprised of the nobility. The third estate was composed of everyone else, rich, poor, middle class, collectively known as commoners. The État Général had no independent power of its own. It convened at the pleasure of the king and served as a sounding board for new policy. Each estate had an equal number of deputies. Thus the first and second estates tended to outvote the third, even though the third estate represented 98% of the French population. Now, as I said in a previous slide, the clergy and nobility of France were exempt from taxation. Thus, the tax burden fell almost entirely on the third estate. King Louis assumed that the other two estates, the clergy and the nobility, would support him and his tax proposal. In light of this manifest injustice, the Third Estate clamored for a reform of the États Généraux. The king seemed to heed their call for reform. For the 1789 meeting, the Third Estate would be granted more deputies, and would even have more deputies than the other two estates combined. However, the three estates now had to vote as blocks. Each estate now had one collective vote. Thus, the first and second estates could still outvote the third. This was the final straw. In protest, the Third Estate met separately and voted themselves into being a National Assembly. Many of the other two estates then joined them, including many priests and nobles. The king tried to force the National Assembly to adjourn. This provoked riots in Paris, which culminated in the storming of the fortress prison and armory known as the Bastille on July 14, 1789. The National Assembly, now armed and largely in control of Paris, began to draft a national constitution. The king, recognizing the impossibility of going back to the old order, acquiesced and gave his consent to the constitution and the legislative acts of the National Assembly. In this slide, we have an artist's depiction of the storming of the Bastille. The National Assembly undertook a radical restructuring of the political order in France. The Church, having been integral to this order for some 1,200 years, was seriously affected by this restructuring. In August of 1789, the Assembly abolished all privileges enjoyed by individuals and social groups, such as the clergy and the nobility. This meant that nobles and clergy now had to pay taxes. Also, involuntary ties to the Church, which had to be paid by every French subject regardless of religious persuasion, were abolished. In November of that same year, 1789, church property was nationalized. Many properties were then sold to help pay down the national debt. Now, these lands had been a vital source of revenue to the church, so in compensation, the Assembly guaranteed that the state would now pay the salaries of all bishops and priests. Now, as radical as these steps may seem, it is important to understand that the bishops and priests and the National Assembly largely supported these measures. Since the church was in fact part of the state, even in the old regime, it made sense for any kind of political reform to extend to the church, at least to some degree. In 1790, however, the revolution took a more radical turn. Radical elements, including a group known as the Jacobins, achieved prominence in the National Assembly and moved the Assembly in the direction clearly at odds with the Church. In spring of that year, religious orders were suppressed. Religious vows were prohibited as contrary to individual liberty. And congregations not devoted to teaching or caring for the sick were closed. In July of that year, the Assembly dealt a deadly blow to the life of the Catholic Church in France with the civil constitution of the clergy. In this act, bishops and parish priests were now to be locally elected by the people, and there was to be no requirement that the electors, that is, those voting for the bishops, be Catholic. Thus, an agnostic, a Freemason, or a Protestant could vote on who would be a Catholic bishop. Also, all bishops and priests, as paid employees of the state, were required to take an oath of loyalty to the civil constitution. This measure effectively made the French clergy subject to the state rather than the Pope. Pope Pius VI naturally rejected and condemned the act. As a result of the civil constitution of the clergy, most priests and bishops and many Catholics turned against the revolution. There were some clerics who took the oath of loyalty and became known as constitutionals, that is, members of the new constitutional church, the Church of the French Republic. The majority refused the oath and came to be known as non-jurors. As devout Catholics by and large withdrew their support for the revolution, the National Assembly became increasingly radical and intolerant of Catholicism, viewing the Church as a reactionary element seeking the restoration of the old regime. Non-juring bishops and priests began to be arrested in major cities throughout France, and many others fled the country. In August of 1792, King Louis was deposed and arrested. France was then proclaimed a republic. The monarchy of some 1,200 years had been abolished. In January 1793, King Louis was beheaded for treason. Coinciding with the execution of King Louis, the revolutionary government undertook a campaign which later historians have termed Dechristianization. Dechristianization was the attempt to eradicate not only Catholicism, although the Catholic Church was the primary target, but any form of Christianity and even any kind of traditional religious practice, including Judaism. Dechristianization involved a number of measures. It involved replacing Christianity with the atheistic cult of reason in an attempt to reorganize and center the new French order on Enlightenment principles shorn of all religion. This was later replaced with the cult of the Supreme Being, which was equally anti-Christian but not atheistic. Dechristianization also involved the closing of churches and the destruction of religious monuments and symbols. In addition, dechristianization involved the prohibition of all public and private worship, both Catholic and Protestant. It involved the prohibition of religious instruction, and it often involved the imprisonment, torture, and death of priests, bishops, religious, and any laity who supported them in any way. Here is a painting of what was called the disaffection of a church in 1794. Disaffection meant basically taking property that was devoted to religious use and converting it to secular, non-religious use. Such measures were very common in revolutionary France during dechristianization. This is a painting of the beheading of 16 Carmelite nuns of Compiègne, whose martyrdom occurred in June 1794. This is a drawing of a religious procession in honor of the goddess Reason. You notice how it takes a form very similar to traditional Catholic processions that were common in Catholic communities in Europe. Thus, it's sort of a mimic or mocking of Catholic devotion. Things more or less continued along these lines until 1799, when the revolutionary government, due largely to its obvious excesses, lost popular support. At the same time, General Napoleon Bonaparte returned triumphantly from a military campaign in Egypt. Napoleon seized power amid popular approval, transforming the republic into a dictatorship. He also began to ease restrictions on the church. Napoleon permitted the return of refugee priests and bishops. Public worship resumed, and churches were allowed to reopen. A definitive settlement was reached between the church and the government in 1801 with a concordat between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII. The terms of the concordat included the following. Catholicism was recognized as the religion of the great majority of Frenchmen, but not given official status as a state religion. Church property seized during the Revolution would not be returned. The government would nominate bishops, and the Pope would canonically install them. Bishops, in turn, appointed priests, and priest salaries were to be paid by the state. In conclusion, I think we can recognize two things. First, the Catholic Church in France underwent a persecution unlike anything it had ever experienced. Yet it survived. which testifies to the vitality of the faith in France during this horrible time. Second, in the French Revolution, we see only the beginning of the ideological clash between Christianity and secularism, a clash which resurfaced even more violently in the 20th century.